No.
Well, I wouldn't mind extra chit chat. Yeah, my topic has been decision making. So it's mainly aimed at improving the actions that we take, especially in real time. Yeah. So different from a science education that we had last week, it's, to my understanding at least, aimed at teaching outside of schools and universities, outside the normal teaching environments. And it's somewhat aimed at various experts with a decent grasp of the basics in their field. So the specific paper, for example, had surgeons and doctors in hospitals taking in patients. And I also found some other papers with, for example, HR employees making decisions on who to hire, and the football coaches that also have to make decisions on the fly during the football match. So it's primarily aimed at experts, but also normal people. And difference from normal teaching would be that you have more involvement in the subjects that happen. You don't have to read a book and 100% focus on the book. Nobody does that. And humans learn differently. So if we aim to adjust the teaching method to the persons, then teaching them how to handle different situations on the fly will be much more optimal. And teaching the important information to people to make those decisions will also be much easier when you lose less people due to boredom. So, at first, how many of you are writing notes, and how many of you are actually not paying attention?
Yeah.
Because I wanted to kind of use that, if you were not paying attention, to say that would be a focus level.
Sure.
Notes.
Yeah. That would be a focused level of attention, in that you are able to respond to a stimuli. If I, for example, tell out your name, that's the lowest level of attention you can pay if you are paying attention. And the sustained level of attention would be that you are able to actually listen to what I'm saying. However, you are still not paying attention too much because you are shifting your focus to, for example, something on the internet, and then you are not paying attention. And then there is the selective level of attention. That's the perfect in our case, in that you maintain a response despite, for example, if the person next to you was watching a movie on their laptop, that if you are able to pay attention regardless of that, then you are having a selective level of attention. And then there's the two more, alternating and divided, where you are starting to multitask. And you're actually able to pay attention to multiple tasks at various degrees. So how does this go into decision making and serious games? Is that we want to maintain the selective level of attention. We would prefer not to have the user pay attention to the game and something else would have them to pay attention. And so we have to engage the user. Now I plugged in the chart thing that we had from the lecture.
What's the author's name again?
Something in Czech, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Michael
yeah?
Czech.
Yeah, I don't think so.
There was some C and London.
I know, I'm just mucking around. So yeah.
So the problem with teaching in a normal setting is that you have a low level of challenge. You have to just listen to what I say, but you are not challenged unless I question you about the matter immediately. So you will have various level of either apathy, boredom, or relaxation because you are not really interested. So the goal would be to increase it so that you actually engage the user. And one way to do this is to use the different senses that people have. So we can see, and that's usually how we take information, but we can also hear, we can taste, smell, and touch things. And I also added in from the Wikipedia, from the 5 different senses from Wikipedia, the focus or thought. That's also sort of what we have. And it can be said that taste and smell is kind of difficult to replicate in serious games. In some group sessions, it could be possible to replicate smell, but it would probably be dependent on the participants, and it would be a negative thing. But sight and hearing is very possible to replicate and should be done if you want to fully engage the user. And it's also possible to replicate touch, for example, in tabletop games if you have some physical games.
Mm. Just simply on it, are you comfortable with me interrupting you, or I prefer at the end? So, can anyone conceive of a serious game that would be involving taste or smell?
Smell? Well, if the person's in decision making, at least, if the person has to make a very quick decision on the fly, then it would be relevant to have a serious game with smell. That would probably not be a digital game though, but it would still be a serious game.
That's right.
That would have to be very aimed at the smell aspect probably, because the person using the game making decisions would have to make decisions probably based on smell. Maybe health workers that go into stores to check whether or not they follow standards. Yep. They could be trained to smell whether or not something is horrible or off, and then know what it is even. And taste would also be relevant for them, though they should probably not taste things that are not good.
There's also the case of like plant workers detecting the different smell of the different gases, right? Being able to detect which kind of gas is leaking, for example. That might be a case.
That is correct.
So this can be said to be primarily on the digital side, but physically it is possible to replicate taste and smell. So I didn't remove them fully, but in the what we think about in digital sense, it's difficult.
Yeah. Just to bring it, because it's an interesting discussion. So just first of all, I find it's good. Number one, serious games don't need to be digital. That's the main thing to take away from this one, right? So abstract away from us. We use tech because we have tech. That doesn't mean we need to use it for, because particularly for visual things and visually, environments is very handy. But there's a lot of applications that are going beyond this, right? So, and you're right. The industrial worker example is a very good one. The very practical example, which is more fun than anything else. You guys know those cooking shows where they actually need to test and figure out what they actually just ate or whatever have in their mouth. That's also basically a serious game, right? Because they get points based on this one, based on accuracy with which they identify a particular or classify an ingredient, right? So I think this could be in the category of serious games as well. Coming back to the computational, just one example. There's quite a bit of work in the area of immersion, right? So the idea is there, okay, how can I ensure that someone in a human-computer interaction is really immersed in the interaction? VR has brought a new hype to it because you're really kind of seemingly immersed. But what if you add, olfactory characteristics, meaning like smell to it, right? And they actually did it. So what they did, just to give some intuitions, is they used there was an experiment. It was in the US somewhere quite some years ago, in the 90s or something. So basically, I used perfume, which could be dispensed based on electric current, right? So you could plug them into USB, and they developed a system where they had different scents, basically plugged into USB ports, and selectively activated the USB ports and mixed them to produce a smell, right? And then use a fan to blow it towards the participant. So depending on, for example, how you change direction in VR, suddenly you would get a different smell, right? So pretty cool what you can do. So point is, even in digital games, it has been used.
I've seen some devices that look like that. There was some stuff that you can attach to your nose.
It's right. Yes.
There is a serious problem with exploitation of that and making you smell stuff that you would never want to smell.
Of course. I mean, but it's the same for anything else. There's a lot of sounds you don't want to hear. There's a lot of sights you don't want to see, right? I mean, you can make that argument in either direction.
I would say that smell goes a little bit further because eyes you can immediately close.
That's right. So
and the smell would probably stay in your nose for the rest of the day.
You probably you need to carefully check your ethics approval for what you're doing there. That's right. So it may be a bit tougher, but in principle, I wouldn't. You're right. They are not as pronounced and not as relevant in practice. I absolutely agree with you. But I still think that all of those senses can be, to some extent, modeled in a serious game. Anyway, but I continue. Sorry, I didn't want to take that. too far.
Well,
Yep.
touch can be to a certain extent replicated. There are some glove stuff that you can use to replicate that you are touching something, and touch would be very good to replicate, because if you make the player actually feel something physically, then you are really getting their attention.
Right.
Yeah. So, I found primarily 3 types of games that were used in actual papers and research. The first one of which was puzzle games, for which I have the example of the specified paper that I submitted, and the risk game. Now, I think that it could be said that the risk game was also a tabletop game, which I'll come back to later, but the risk game and the paper was basically, it was basically a quiz or a puzzle, and there wasn't much tabletop there. But yeah, the puzzle games basically force the players to think. There isn't much interaction between the user and the game, as much as the user has to interact with themselves and think what to do. So not all senses are in use, but there's more focus on solving the puzzle, and that's a problem, because it may make the player not learn what you want. They may learn to solve the puzzle and not learn to solve the thing in real life later. So when looking at the example 1 from the trauma triage game in the specified paper, the players were doctors of various degrees, and they learned how to better detect representative cases, so obvious cases where they will have to send people to a trauma center and a better hospital. But as the paper found out, they didn't become much more innovative, and they didn't think of the non-representative cases as much. They still had better results than the control groups, both the ones that used the written text, the written form of learning, and no learning at all. But they were worse than the other game that I'll come back to later. And another example would be the risk game that was the paper on the wiki page, where the players were experts in maritime surveillance, basically during a NATO conference, to my understanding. And the players had to make decisions based on limited information, and had basically 2 scenarios where one ship where the ship could either be traveling back to home, to a different country, or be traveling towards them, and they had to make a decision of whether or not to send a patrol aircraft, and they had the information that they were in a heightened state of alert. And that game in particular taught the players more about themselves and their current experience, and what decisions they are capable of making based on the limited information. And what's interesting to find is that the heightened state of alert, they sent out the airplane 75% of the time. So that's interesting to hear. But given that it was a heightened state of alert, they would have probably assumed that they should be more cautious. Yeah, I don't have pictures of the first, or I don't have the pictures of the first example. They didn't provide any, and in the paper there was a link to some outcome assessment tool and possibly the game, but I found there a link instead to another article from 2 years ago that appeared to have different data sets and different games, so sadly they don't have pictures of that game. But these figures are from the second example. So basically they have this port of Herosea where the scenario takes place, and they have to make the decision to make whether the vessel is A or B, and whether or not they should send the airplane or not. And the ships are the same size type, or they are the same type, so they have no way to differentiate between the vessels. So the next type of games that I found was also in the specified paper, which was very convenient to have 2 types of games in one paper. And it had a higher involvement in trying to solve the game, because as they said, it was a narrative-based game, while the previous puzzle game was more on user knowledge. So it used more of the senses of the user and tried to make them actually feel invested in the story. So they would actually think as if they were in a trauma triage center, and they would actually make decisions. So it makes the user kind of think less, but act more, and later maybe they'll learn from it more. So the one example that I have of that is that they were found to be better in the non-representative cases, because apparently they are supposed to actually triage people to a trauma center if they take a fall and are elderly and situations like that, and they aren't usually trained to triage people in those situations, but because of the game they were able to in much higher percentage triage people correctly because of that. However, what's interesting is that to the same degree as the puzzle game, they weren't able to triage the representative cases as much. In both cases, both studies were 20% better in triaging people in the bad situation and 30% better in their good side. It's kind of interesting how it's kind of equal. And the last games, the last type of game that I found were the tabletop games that I found at least studies of. They can have group involvement if they are multiplayer. That was the first game that I found, which was interesting. The title was in English in all caps, so I found it in the results and decided to click on it. And then I found that the entire paper was written in Polish, which is convenient for me, but not for you. Yeah, and then you can use more senses than in an individual puzzle in tabletop games, but the focus may shift from learning to group interaction, especially if it's a group activity, then players may interact between each other and learn less. But the game is wants them to teach them more how to interact. So in the fourth game example, the game's players were the HR experts in a large company. That if I'm using a Sumatra PDF, I don't have the notes, but from my understanding there were 9 HR experts playing this game from a company in northern Poland with about 3,000 people that they were hiring. So it was a fairly large company in the energy and transport sector. And their results were that the players were more interested in cooperative play than compete between each other, even though there were mechanics to allow them to do so, like fight over better employees in the tabletop game, because they wanted to understand the rules of the game better than they wanted to learn how to become better HR experts. So it became more of a game for them in the casual sense. So mechanics in that sense made it right. And there was another aspect that they also found, that there was something that had a very high cost to it in the game, but the game kind of focused a bit about that. In each turn there would be like 6 different actions, and there was an action that would make the players cost a lot of money, but since the game focused a lot on that, or they felt that they focused on it, then the players actually spent a lot of their in-game money to spend on that, even though it may have been a bad decision in the particular game. But because they felt that the game was focusing a lot of that, so they should spend money on that. So in this case, mechanics were actually distracting players from good playing of the game. Overall, the HR experts actually kind of liked the game. They weren't too experienced with serious games, so they treated it more like a product to review their status, I think. It was still interesting to find the paper, and that only I could understand in this class and tell to you what's in there. And another game, tabletop game that I found was with football referees in Turkey. So the players were beginning football referees, and they first gathered information from experts or retired referees. And the game served to mentally relax them while teaching them concepts using traditional means. So they had multiple choice questions to answer. They could toss the dice and then have pick it between multiple choice questions, video questions, in similar matter. It kind of teach them in that traditional sense, but kind of tried to relax them a little bit more, I think. I didn't read this paper fully, but I tried to get the gist of it. And the results were kind of debatable in this paper for them, because in the pre-test and post-test that they had the same questions, and in both experiment and control groups they kind of had increase in quality, so they may have failed their goals. And this was basically the game that they had with I think the B fields are basically the bonus fields where the player wouldn't go back, so as not to penalize the player too much if they were failing too much in the questions. And
can you help us a bit there to understand what that is? I mean, I know what it is, but
it's a very simple, like, start to finish type of game, to my understanding.
But are they judging basically making decision based on the positions of the player? Let's say position 1, 2, 3.
This is the experiment to teach. Yeah, maybe I forgot kind of because, but there were an experiment and a control group where the experiment group was learning using this game, and the control group were learning with the laws of the game book that they usually use, and they couldn't use the other one of the. So basically, the experiment group was learning using those multiple choice video questions and those sorts of questions, and if they answered correctly, then they would go forward. Okay. That's basically the simple rundown of what's going on in the game. So they throw the dice, take a question and answer it. The answer is not correct, then they go one step backward, except if they are on the bonus step, then they stop. So they don't go too far back. But in my opinion, it was just it was written as somewhat of a serious game, but in my opinion, it was just a way to abstract it a little bit away. And yeah, the results were that in both groups there was an increase, and the questions in the test questions were exactly the same. So odds are they just remembered the questions and kind of learned the answer to it.
So if the results increased in both groups, which
the results in the experiment group increased a little bit more.
Yeah.
However, they didn't increase much.
Right.
Yeah.
So the increase across both groups was more than the relative increase in the test group. Is that what you're suggesting? No.
Yeah.
Well, if you have that effect, what do you suspect is happening?
I suspect that all the players and test group people have remembered some question that they weren't really certain about, probably. And then during the learning process, they learned the answer to those questions.
I see.
Because the test questions were exactly the same and in the same order even, so they would know. Yeah. However, they weren't told that the answers to the questions also. They weren't also told the answers to the questions. But
it's definitely a learning effect there.
Yeah, it's sort of a learning effect. So the paper has issues, but they kind of try to use the games to teach people differently, and in some cases they had some results, but they were individual, not representative across the entire group.
Right.
Yeah. And while I was asked to also review some business games by you, there were a lot of games on those lists, and the paper mainly focused on the business side of things, how much things cost and that sort of thing. And I may have picked the bad game to start looking into them because I found some simulation for teaching.
Okay.
So I kind of got uninterested in looking through every single game.
That's honest.
But there are some games in various sectors in the reference. At the bottom of the paper list, there are about 3,000 games there. That was also way too many to check for good games.
What do you do if you have those cases? I mean, later on in a year or so, you guys are starting to write up your masters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have suddenly this kind of problem that you have a database you need to look at, right? So in some you have 3,000 entries, or it may just be papers and references. How do you deal with this? What do you guys do? What would be strategies of dealing with this? Because you can, of course, you can do strategy. I call it strategy ostrich. Ignore everything.
Yeah.
So, what's the alternative strategies? Everyone. Because that's important. That's something you will face.
Start to Googling the games and see how many results you get. If you get a lot of results on this game and the results appear to be of the game, then it's probably used more. And if the searching name of the game doesn't give you the game,
Yeah.
as was the case in the second game I was looking at from that paper, then the game isn't probably all that used much.
Okay,
Yeah.
but, so that's one way, but it still has this sequential thing of technically you need to Google all of it, right? So
Yeah.
it's so what's still alternative pathways?
Learning Python.
Learning Python, yes, right,
Yes.
yeah. Activate your data science skills. Cool, yeah.
Mm.
That's number 3.
That would be my choice afterwards. If I
Yeah.
had a lot of games to go through and the initial testing didn't give me good results, I would have to try to search for some API, try to look at how many clicks various games got.
Oh, that's
stuff
cool.
like that.
So you look at metadata, but let's stick to the papers themselves. What could be a possible pathway to do?
Try to find alternative keywords.
There you go, right? So keywords is one way. Doing it syntactic purely, right? So that's the systematic literature review approach to some extent, that you basically just figure out keywords that you deem relevant, right? So and kind of filter then, coarsely, filter down the papers, right? So that's one possible pathway that you could take. So if you're under pressure and present something quickly and you don't have the time to do a full, for a master thesis, yes, you of course need to do your systematic literature review and filter down the papers of relevance. But for this case here, if you want to do something, what would be another pathway you could take?
I could look more broadly at serious games and try to find the applications where they were used, where they didn't specifically mention decision making, but they didn't use it in an education setting.
Right. So that would be a filtering problem, right? Because you would probably look specifically for business, for example, not education or something like this. Because once you review two of those papers and you find this weird situation, then you can exclude, a term, for example, as well, right? But what I'm more thinking about, I mean, if you're in the situation of having so many different papers, one possible pathway also is to sample, right? Basically, you do a probabilistic. You basically throw dice and see what paper do I look at, right? So for expositions, not to have a comprehensive literature review. You can't claim you have a comprehensive survey, but you can give me at least an impression, right? You did this implicitly because you're talking about it, but you can also do it a bit more explicitly. You're saying here, I'm sampling randomly, and then you either detect structure, that is, what kind of business areas do you look in, HR, production, logistics, perhaps you see those patterns. Alternative, you don't, then pick papers that you think are, not of course all the same, but, could be an interesting example of sets. HR was one of those, but to give us a more educated insight, so we actually take something away from it, it would be good to have, some of those papers. You just say, those are just 3 samples out of 3,000, not representative, but this gives you the gist, as you said yourself. So those are different pathways to take, and they're a bit better than the ostrich way. So, at least you get an impression. So.
Yeah, I kind of focused on having, on looking for papers through NTNU, the Literaturssök.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted papers that were kind of good to reference in my presentation. So I could list, for example, the HR game, and here's the link to the scientific paper that actually used it.
Yeah.
I kind of had a focus on that rather than looking for just serious games that existed out there.
Yeah, that's sensible. That's also a discriminator, right? You could say, I only pick serious games that are actually scientifically treated, right? So not just for fun or whatever, right? So
or for economics.
Or for economics, that's right. Okay, anyway, back to you, sorry.
Yeah, so the specific paper I found was very quickly found, and it conveniently had a puzzle and an adventure game. And the puzzle turned out to be better in teaching the obvious cases, and the adventure handled non-representative cases better, but both were significantly better than the traditional means of just using a textbook or showing up to the test without reading at all. Yeah. That's kind of what I have.
Okay, right.
Before we go deeply into the
right, okay, so that's kind of your overview of everything that we discussed about, right? What's the timing right now? You guys, are you favoring, oh, you caught me. Are you favoring breaks or non-breaks? Ah, the undecisive group. It's about decision making. Come on, guys.
You can take a break.
Yeah,
break?
okay,
let's until 10, so we have 8 minutes or something, right? Cool, cheers.
Yeah.